One tweet. That's all it took to flip the narrative and leave Karoline Leavitt stunned. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a press conference. It was a single, razor-sharp line fired off in the middle of the night that would ricochet through timelines, newsrooms, and dinner table conversations across the country. The digital battlefield lit up instantly. Twitter, now X, was humming like a hornet's nest. Notifications flared, hashtags began their climb, and within minutes, the tweet had grown into something larger than politics. It felt like a cultural moment. News anchors scrambled to rewrite their scripts. Podcasters rushed to record emergency episodes. Influencers clipped screenshots like they were capturing history in real time. And somewhere on the other side of the screen, Karoline Leavitt scrolled and realized that her carefully crafted attempt to cancel Jasmine Crockett had detonated in her own hands. This wasn't just a tweet. It was a mic drop, a digital strike that reframed the entire confrontation. The choice of words was precise, the timing perfect, and the delivery carried a mix of wit, dignity, and unshakable confidence that left critics either stunned into silence or forced into awkward defenses. Crockett hadn't shouted. She hadn't raged. She had simply flipped the script with the kind of grace that makes arrogance look small and truth feel undeniable. But how did we even get here? Why did Leavitt believe she could dismantle a rising voice like Jasmine Crockett with a smear, a jab, an attempt to erase her credibility? And why did one woman's quick strike on social media ripple outward like a thunderclap across the nation? To understand why this single tweet shattered Leavitt's strategy, we have to rewind. The battle didn't begin with that tweet. It began with a calculated strike from Karoline Leavitt, a move as deliberate as it was predictable. Leavitt, polished and ambitious, stepped into the public square armed with the kind of rhetoric that thrives on division. Her target was Jasmine Crockett, a freshman congresswoman who had already earned a reputation for speaking with unflinching clarity and carrying herself with a confidence rooted not in privilege, but in hard-won authenticity. To Leavitt, Crockett was the perfect foil, a young, outspoken black woman, unafraid to challenge the establishment, unwilling to shrink. So Leavitt did what figures like her often do. She tried to discredit Crockett with a smear designed to sting, a soundbite meant to circulate. Her words dripped with the familiar cadence of cancel culture theatrics, part performance, part provocation, carefully crafted for maximum amplification. The aim wasn't truth, it was humiliation. And the gamble was simple. In today's hypercharged media ecosystem, the first punch often sets the tone. If Leavitt could define Crockett in the public imagination, she could box her into a corner before Crockett had the chance to fight back. But what Leavitt underestimated was the moment we're living in. This wasn't just about two politicians trading barbs. It was about the broader cultural war simmering across America. At its core, this clash symbolized something deeper, whose voices get silenced and whose voices get amplified. For Leavitt's side, the tactic was familiar. Discredit the messenger, dismiss the lived experience, drown out dissent. For Crockett's supporters, it was about dignity, representation, fairness. The idea that an attempt to erase or belittle one woman's identity wasn't just an attack on her, it was an attack on the millions who saw themselves reflected in her. Every headline, every trending hashtag, every clipped video was infused with that tension. Crockett's presence in Congress represented the kind of America that is still struggling to be fully seen. Immigrant families, working-class roots, women of color who had to fight twice as hard for half as much recognition. Leavitt's attempt to cancel her wasn't just political maneuvering. It was a symbolic attempt to roll back the clock, to remind her and everyone like her of the old pecking order. That's why this moment mattered, because beyond the personalities, beyond the theatrics, what was really on trial was the promise of America itself. Could dignity survive in an era where insults spread faster than facts? Could representation hold its ground against the machinery of spin and smear? And could fairness be more than a talking point? Could it actually cut through the noise when it mattered most? The internet watched, waiting for the next move. Pundits speculated whether Crockett would respond at all. Some wondered if she'd remain silent, letting the story die out on its own. Others expected a fiery retort, a counterpunch to match the aggression of the attack. But Crockett was biding her time, weighing her moment, preparing her words. She understood something Leavitt didn't. In the arena of modern politics, patience can be more powerful than speed, and precision more devastating than volume. And just when it looked like Leavitt had the upper hand, Jasmine delivered a curveball no one saw coming. Karoline Leavitt built her brand on being sharp-tongued, combative, and unflinchingly ambitious. A young Republican strategist turned congressional candidate, she entered politics not as a bridge builder, but as a disruptor. Her presence on cable news panels and in campaign rallies became defined by one thing: a willingness to attack. To her supporters, she was fearless, a rising star, unafraid to say the quiet part out loud. To her critics, she was reckless, a figure who mistook cruelty for candor and volume for strength. Leavitt mastered the mechanics of online outrage. She knew how to craft a tweet designed to provoke, how to frame a soundbite that would travel across social media within minutes. Every barb carried a dual purpose: to elevate her own profile and to diminish the target. Immigrants, progressive women, journalists, anyone who could be painted as other became fodder for her brand of politics. In her world, confrontation wasn't the cost of politics, it was the currency. Patterns emerged quickly. A clip here, a headline there, each one designed to keep her name in circulation. The strategy was simple: dominate the conversation, even if it meant sparking backlash. Because in Leavitt's calculation, controversy was never a liability. It was fuel. What she didn't notice, or perhaps chose to ignore, was the subtle shift happening around her. The very arrogance that made her seem bold to some was setting the stage for her downfall. She carried herself with the unshakable confidence of someone convinced she couldn't lose. Every attack, every attempt to belittle her opponents, was launched with the assumption that they would stay on the defensive, scrambling to respond. Leavitt thrived in that imbalance of power, mistaking silence for weakness and composure for retreat. And that's where the irony set in. Because while Leavitt believed she was cementing her dominance, she was actually sowing the seeds of her own undoing. By leaning harder and harder into the politics of insult, she built a reputation that was brittle. The louder she became, the easier it was for one moment, one perfectly timed strike, to expose the hollowness beneath the bravado. She had built her empire on the assumption that no opponent would outmaneuver her in her own arena. But little did she know, the person she tried to belittle had already mastered the art of the counterpunch. Jasmine Crockett's story could not have been more different. Where Karoline Leavitt projected ambition polished for the cameras, Crockett embodied resilience born from lived experience. Raised with community values, she grew up seeing firsthand how systems often ignored or dismissed those without privilege. That reality shaped her, fueling a drive not just to succeed, but to make space for others who weren't supposed to have a voice. Her path to Congress wasn't smooth. It was marked by challenges that could have broken anyone with less resolve. Early in her career as an attorney, Crockett found herself fighting cases others were too afraid to touch, standing beside the marginalized, the overlooked, the forgotten. She defended clients who couldn't afford power brokers or backroom deals, and in the process, she sharpened not just her legal skills, but her instinct for justice. Each courtroom appearance was a training ground for the larger fights that would eventually await her on the national stage. When she entered politics, she carried that same energy into the halls of power. Unlike Leavitt, Crockett didn't thrive on provocation for its own sake. She thrived on clarity, on being direct, on being unapologetically herself. It was this authenticity that set her apart. She didn't need to posture or invent personas. She stood firmly in her own identity, and in doing so, gave others permission to do the same. In Congress, Crockett quickly developed a reputation, not for grandstanding, but for her quick wit, her sharp grasp of policy, and her ability to hold her ground in heated committee hearings. Viewers who tuned in expecting a quiet newcomer instead found someone who could dismantle a convoluted argument with a single, piercing question. Her calm strength disarmed opponents. Her ability to punctuate a debate with humor or precision made her unforgettable. It wasn't always easy. She faced the predictable attempts to minimize her. Too young, too inexperienced, too brash. But each label thrown at her only seemed to sharpen her resolve. Rather than retreat, she leaned into the qualities others tried to weaponize against her. She wore her background, her accent, her style as badges of honor, reminders that she hadn't come to Congress to blend in. She had come to change the rhythm of the room. Crockett's supporters saw in her something beyond politics. They saw representation, a voice that mirrored their own struggles and aspirations. She wasn't polished into oblivion. She was real. And in today's political landscape, realness is rare enough to be radical. That authenticity made her not just a legislator, but a symbol. A reminder that dignity doesn't require conformity, and that courage often looks like refusing to bow when others demand it. Every confrontation she endured, every attempt to silence her, only added to her reputation as someone who could not be intimidated. She had faced louder voices, bigger platforms, and higher stakes long before stepping onto the national stage. And each time, she had walked away. Not diminished, but strengthened. This is why the clash with Karoline Leavitt mattered so much. Because Crockett wasn't just another opponent in Leavitt's playbook. She was a different kind of fighter, forged in a different kind of battle. She didn't confuse dignity with weakness, nor silence with submission. She knew the power of waiting for the right moment, the right words, the right strike. And that's what made her so dangerous to someone like Leavitt. Crockett had no need to chase every insult. She could hold her fire until the moment mattered most. She could let arrogance build its own stage, then walk in and dismantle it with a single, devastating move. Everything in her journey had prepared her for this exact moment. The clash didn't fade after Leavitt's first strike. It accelerated. Like a boxer who believes she has her opponent against the ropes, Karoline Leavitt came swinging again and again. Her feed lit up with posts aimed squarely at Jasmine Crockett. Each one dripped with the same familiar arrogance, dismissive phrases, snide remarks, and the calculated sting of someone who believed repetition would cement perception. The attacks were sharp, but predictable. They leaned on caricature, attempting to flatten Crockett into an easy target, and for a moment, it seemed to work. Headlines echoed Leavitt's jabs, conservative commentators amplified her words, and the noise threatened to drown out the substance. It was the tactic Leavitt had used many times before: create the storm, dominate the airwaves, and watch as her opponents stumble to keep up. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't stumbling. She was waiting, patiently, deliberately. While Leavitt fired off tweet after tweet, Crockett maintained a kind of poised silence that was louder than any response. She didn't match insult for insult. She didn't scramble to defend herself at every turn. She let the frenzy build, knowing that the more Leavitt swung wildly, the more off balance she would become. Meanwhile, the digital arena turned into a battlefield. Supporters of Leavitt and Crockett clashed in replies and retweets. Hashtags trended, memes circulated, and the clash took on a life of its own. Commentators described it like a prize fight, round after round unfolding in real time for millions of spectators. For some, the silence from Crockett was puzzling. Was she retreating? Was she conceding ground? Or was something else brewing beneath the surface? That uncertainty only heightened the tension. Every refresh of the timeline carried anticipation. People were waiting, watching, whispering that Crockett was too sharp to let these attacks go unanswered. The question was not if she would respond, but when, and how devastating it would be when she finally did. The contrast could not have been clearer. On one side, a combative figure hurling attacks with abandon, growing louder and more erratic with each post. On the other, a steady presence, refusing to be rattled, conserving energy for a moment that would matter. Hero versus villain, arrogance versus composure, noise versus strategy. And then, with one tweet, Crockett flipped the script. It happened in an instant, but it felt like slow motion. After days of patience, Jasmine Crockett finally chose her moment. One tweet, short, precise, delivered with the kind of timing comedians and courtroom attorneys dream of. The words weren't laced with fury or drenched in insult. They were calm, confident, and devastatingly clear. Crockett didn't just clap back. She reframed the entire narrative in fewer than 280 characters. The brilliance of the tweet was in its construction. Every syllable carried weight. It didn't rant, it didn't ramble, it didn't lower itself to the pettiness Leavitt had wallowed in. Instead, it turned Leavitt's attack on its head, exposing the hollowness of the smear without ever needing to raise its voice. Wit and dignity, delivered in perfect harmony. It was the digital equivalent of a mic dropping on marble floors. Clean, sharp, impossible to ignore. And the timing? Perfect. Not in the heat of Leavitt's barrage, not when emotions were raw, but after the storm had peaked. Crockett waited until Leavitt's noise was loud enough to command attention, then cut through it with one decisive strike. The effect was cinematic. The moment her tweet hit the timeline, the energy shifted. For a heartbeat, the internet went quiet. It was as though everyone reading was taking a breath, processing what they had just witnessed. And then, the eruption. Replies poured in, retweets multiplied, screenshots spread across feeds like wildfire. Commentators labeled it a masterclass in political precision. Supporters cheered, "This is how you do it." Strangers who had never followed Crockett before jumped in, hitting like and share, making her words inescapable. The reactions told the story as much as the tweet itself. She ended her with dignity. This is what real leadership looks like. Class over chaos, every time. The replies were a chorus, drowning out Leavitt's earlier noise. Hashtags shifted. Suddenly, the narrative wasn't about Leavitt's smear. It was about Crockett's command. And Leavitt? The confidence that had once seemed unshakable began to crumble in real time. Her responses grew scattered, defensive. She tried to claw back the spotlight, but every new post only highlighted the contrast. Crockett's single strike versus Leavitt's desperate flailing. It was the unraveling of a strategy that had seemed bulletproof just days before. The villain who thrived on provocation found herself silenced, not by force, but by elegance. Observers could almost feel the balance of power tilting. In the span of one tweet, the aggressor became the embarrassed, and the intended victim became the victor. The entire digital arena had witnessed a reversal so sharp, so undeniable that it was destined to be replayed in highlight reels of political clapbacks for years to come. The validation kept building. Celebrities chimed in. Journalists referenced it in their pieces. Everyday users flooded Crockett's mentions with applause emojis and fire gifs. It wasn't just a political moment. It was a cultural one. Crockett had shown that in a landscape dominated by noise, sometimes the sharpest weapon is restraint, followed by precision. But the story didn't end there. The aftershock spread far beyond one tweet. The moment Jasmine Crockett's tweet landed, the internet transformed into a stage for aftershocks. Social media didn't just react, it erupted. Within minutes, hashtags spun into the trending list. #Crockett clapback, #tweet heard round the hill, #Leavitt lost. Memes flooded in like waves, each one sharper, funnier, and more humiliating for Karoline Leavitt than the last. Screenshots of Crockett's words were plastered on Instagram stories, TikTok stitches, and Facebook feeds. It was no longer politics. It was pop culture. The digital chorus was deafening. One user wrote, "She owned her with a single tweet." Another declared, "That's how you dismantle arrogance, with dignity, not noise." Thousands echoed the sentiment, creating a ripple effect that seemed unstoppable. Even people who had never followed congressional debates before were suddenly invested, curious about the congresswoman who had turned an online smear into a masterclass of composure. News outlets scrambled to catch up. Headlines framed it as a turning point moment, and the tweet that flipped the narrative. Commentators debated it on primetime panels. Some marveled at Crockett's restraint, how she'd let Leavitt punch herself out before delivering the knockout blow. Others analyzed the broader cultural impact, pointing out how a single voice, wielding clarity, could silence the cacophony of manufactured outrage. For Leavitt, it was brutal. Cable news hosts replayed her initial attack side by side with Crockett's response, the contrast so glaring it bordered on comedy. Meanwhile, Crockett's stature grew almost overnight. Her follower count spiked, her name trended for days, and her profile was suddenly larger than the confines of her district. She wasn't just a congresswoman anymore. She had become a symbol, proof that dignity and wit could triumph in an era where insults seemed to dominate. For her supporters, it was validation. For young women of color watching from the sidelines, it was inspiration. And for political insiders, it was a reminder. Underestimate her, at your peril. Leavitt, on the other hand, found herself on the receiving end of ridicule she couldn't control. Every attempt she made to reclaim the narrative only added fuel to the fire. Her words, once amplified, now echoed back at her with mockery. In the public square, the imbalance had flipped completely. What had begun as her attempt to cancel someone else had spiraled into a cancellation of her own credibility. The ripple effects were undeniable. Late-night comedians worked the moment into their monologues. Influencers turned Crockett's tweet into merch, shirts, mugs, even phone cases. A cultural shorthand had been born, one that would linger far longer than any single exchange of political insults. And in the middle of this firestorm, a larger lesson emerged. In the days that followed, Jasmine Crockett made it clear that her response was never just about Karoline Leavitt. It wasn't about scoring internet points or basking in the glow of a viral moment. Crockett reframed the entire exchange into something larger, something enduring, a lesson that dignity will always outlast arrogance. One tweet may have carried the spark, but the fire it lit was about more than a political feud. It was about values. She reminded her supporters, and even her critics, that the power of truth doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to twist or manipulate. Truth cuts through the noise on its own, as long as it's carried with clarity and conviction. That was the essence of her counterattack. She didn't meet arrogance with equal arrogance. She met it with poise. She didn't try to match Leavitt's volume. She showed that authenticity speaks louder than theatrics ever could. The moment became symbolic, not because of the cleverness of a single tweet, but because of what it revealed about the hunger in American life for justice and representation. People weren't just celebrating Crockett's wit. They were celebrating the idea that someone who reflects their lived experience could stand tall against the machinery of dismissal and come out stronger. They were celebrating the possibility of politics, grounded not in performance, but in principle. For young women, immigrants, and communities too often told to stay quiet, the exchange stood as proof. You don't have to conform to someone else's definition of legitimacy to claim your space. For those tired of watching arrogance dominate headlines, it offered a rare breath of validation. It was a reminder that power doesn't just belong to the loudest voice in the room. It belongs to the voice that carries dignity, even in the face of mockery. The moral clarity of the moment echoed far beyond Washington. It touched anyone who has ever been underestimated, belittled, or written off, only to find strength in staying true to themselves. And Crockett, in her own understated way, reminded the country that politics can still surprise us, not with scandal or cynicism, but with grace. But how do we make sure moments like this aren't forgotten? In the end, it all came back to that single moment. One tweet. That's all it took to turn the tables, to strip the theatrics of cancel culture bare, and to remind the nation that dignity is the most powerful rebuttal of all. Karoline Leavitt had tried to write Jasmine Crockett's story for her, casting her as a target to be diminished. But with clarity and grace, Crockett seized back the pen and wrote a different ending, one where arrogance collapsed under its own weight, and authenticity stood unshaken. That's the heart of this story. It wasn't the noise that mattered. It was the stillness. It wasn't the volume of the insults, but the precision of the truth. Crockett showed that you don't need to match cruelty to defeat it. You don't need to play dirty to win. You just need to stand firm, rooted in who you are, and let your dignity do the talking. And maybe that's the lesson we all take with us. In an era where outrage sells, it's grace that endures. In a culture addicted to noise, it's clarity that cuts through. If you believe in voices that fight back with dignity, share this story. If you believe arrogance doesn't deserve the final word, subscribe and stay with us. Together, we can amplify truth over noise, representation over dismissal, and dignity over hate. Because one voice, one message, one tweet can change everything.